She was a ruthless billionaire CEO who thought everyone was replaceable. He was a desperate single father who just lost his only lifeline. But when the termination papers were signed, she had no idea that in exactly 14 minutes, this fired employee would be the only man capable of saving her life. The Vanguard Medical Innovations Tower loomed over the Chicago skyline like a jagged shard of black glass. On the 72nd floor, the air was perpetually chilled, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive espresso. Here, Victoria Hastings ruled her empire. At 38, Victoria was a self-made billionaire, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of the biomedical engineering sector by stripping away anything and anyone that didn't run at peak efficiency. She didn't tolerate excuses. She didn't believe in second chances, and she certainly didn't care about the personal lives of the 3,000 employees on her payroll. David Gallagher was employee number 2401. David wasn't an executive or a hotshot developer. He was a senior systems technician, the man who knew the sprawling, heavily automated skyscraper's nervous system better than the architects who designed it. He spent his days in the sub-basements and maintenance shafts, grease on his hands, ensuring the climate control, elevator redundancies, and fire suppression systems operated flawlessly. But lately, David's own life had been failing. 9 months ago, his wife had passed away in a car accident, leaving him alone to raise their 7-year-old daughter, Chloe. Worse still, Chloe had recently been diagnosed with a severe autoimmune disorder. Between the endless doctor's appointments, the sudden hospital runs, and the crushing weight of medical debt, David was drowning. He had been late to work 3 times that month. His supervisor, a meticulously groomed corporate ladder climber named Richard Cunningham, had flagged David's file for review. Victoria Hastings was currently leading a ruthless company-wide restructuring, personally reviewing the files of underperforming assets. When Richard placed David's file on her mahogany desk, pointing out the tardiness, Victoria barely blinked. "Cut him," she ordered, her voice devoid of emotion as she signed a multi-million-dollar merger document without looking up. "He's been here 6 years, Ms. Hastings," Richard noted, trying to play devil's advocate. "He actually requested a brief meeting with you. He's outside now. He was late this morning because his daughter had a respiratory crisis." Victoria finally looked up. Her eyes, a piercing, icy blue, locked onto Richard. "Do I look like a social worker, Richard? I'm running a company that pioneers artificial organs, not a charity. Send him in. I'll handle it myself." When David walked into the expansive office, he looked exactly like a man who hadn't slept in 3 days. His uniform was clean but worn, his shoulders slumped, and in his hands, he nervously twisted a blue security badge. "Ms. Hastings," David began, his voice tight. "Thank you for seeing me. I know I've been flagged by HR. I need to explain." "There is no need for explanations, Mr. Gallagher," Victoria said sharply. She stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored designer suit, projecting absolute authority. "Your attendance record is unacceptable. You are 15 minutes late today. You were 20 minutes late last Tuesday. In my company, precision is everything. If the technicians maintaining my building cannot manage a simple clock, they are a liability." David stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Ms. Hastings, please. My daughter, Chloe. She had a severe asthma attack this morning. I had to wait for her breathing to stabilize before I could leave her with the nurse. I'm a single father. My wife died last year. If I lose this job, I lose our health insurance. I lose the treatments keeping my little girl out of the ICU." He hated begging. He felt a hot flush of humiliation creeping up his neck, but he swallowed his pride. He would crawl on his hands and knees if it meant keeping Chloe safe. Victoria stared at him. For a fraction of a second, there might have been a flicker of sympathy, but it was instantly smothered by years of hardened corporate discipline. "Mr. Gallagher, everyone has a story," she said, her tone flat. "Everyone has a tragedy. If I kept every employee who gave me a sob story, Vanguard would be bankrupt. You chose to let your personal life interfere with your professional obligations. That is not my problem." She pushed a manila envelope across her desk. "Your severance package is inside. Security will escort you to your locker. You have 10 minutes. David stared at the envelope. The finality of the words hit him like a physical blow. The world tilted on its axis. He thought of Chloe, sitting in her hospital bed, gripping her stuffed bear, trusting her daddy to fix everything. "You don't understand the building's infrastructure," David said, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper, trying a different angle. "The new automated security protocols, they have fatal flaws in the fire suppression logic. I'm the only one who knows how to manually bypass the primary relay in the east shaft. If you fire me—" "Are you threatening my infrastructure, Mr. Gallagher?" Victoria interrupted, her eyes narrowing into dangerous slits. "No, I'm telling you that you need me, and I need this job." "Stan," Victoria called out to the hulking security guard standing by the frosted glass doors. "Escort Mr. Gallagher out of the building. Revoke his clearance immediately." David looked at the billionaire CEO. He saw no humanity left in her. She was a machine. "You have all this money," David said softly, the fight draining out of him. "All this power. And you don't care about a single soul but yourself." "Good day, Mr. Gallagher." Stan placed a heavy hand on David's shoulder. David didn't resist. He turned and walked out of the office, his life in ruins. Clutching the envelope that contained a pathetic 2 weeks of severance pay. 14 minutes later, David was in the sub-basement, throwing his wrenches, voltage meters, and a framed photo of Chloe into a cardboard box. His hands were shaking. He didn't know how he was going to tell his daughter. He didn't know how he was going to pay the rent next week. The oppressive silence of the concrete basement was suffocating. 65 floors above him, Victoria Hastings was packing her leather briefcase. She was scheduled to attend a press conference across town to announce Vanguard's record-breaking third-quarter profits. She walked past her assistants, ignoring their nervous goodbyes, and approached her private elevator. The executive drop was a marvel of engineering, a reinforced glass cylinder that ran down the exterior of the building, offering a terrifyingly beautiful view of the city before cutting inward at the 20th floor. It was completely automated, tied to the building's central AI, and accessible only by Victoria's biometric scan. She pressed her thumb to the scanner. The glass doors slid open with a soft, expensive hiss. She stepped inside, hit the button for the lobby, and the elevator began its rapid, smooth descent. 59, 58, 57. Suddenly, a massive, concussive boom echoed through the core of the skyscraper. Down in the sub-basement, the lights violently flickered, then died, plunging David into darkness before the red emergency strobes flared to life. The concrete floor vibrated beneath his boots. Up in the elevator shaft, disaster had struck. A catastrophic failure in the building's newly upgraded mainframe had sent a massive power surge through the grid. The main server room on the 70th floor sparked, igniting a devastating electrical fire. The building's AI, reacting to the surge and the fire, instantly initiated a Level 5 lockdown protocol. The executive drop slammed to a violent halt between the 55th and 56th floors. Victoria was thrown against the glass wall, her briefcase spilling documents everywhere. She gasped, scrambling to her feet. "Hello? Security!" she yelled, slamming her hand against the emergency comms button. Static hissed back at her. "Ms. Hastings. Server room. Massive failure. Trapped." Richard's voice crackled through the speaker before dying completely in a squeal of feedback. Victoria looked up through the glass ceiling of her elevator. Her heart stopped. Thick, black, acrid smoke was pouring down the elevator shaft from the fire above. The emergency brakes on the elevator had engaged so hard that the friction had ignited the grease on the primary cables. Fire was now actively raining down the shaft toward her glass cage. The AI system, recognizing the fire, did exactly what it was programmed to do. It sealed the shaft. Heavy steel blast doors slammed shut above and below the elevator, theoretically containing the fire. But it also effectively sealed Victoria inside a vacuum. The glass box was airtight, and the fire burning directly above the cab was rapidly consuming the remaining oxygen in the shaft. Down in the control room adjacent to the basement lockers, David Gallagher watched the massive monitor banks light up with critical warnings. The skeleton crew of remaining technicians was panicking. "The servers are fried. The blast doors are sealed," shouted a junior tech, furiously typing on his keyboard. "The fire department is outside, but the AI won't release the exterior locks. They can't get in." "Where's the fire?" David demanded, stepping into the control room, his termination completely forgotten. "Server room, floor 70. But the surge locked the executive drop. Hastings is trapped in the shaft at floor 55. The cables are burning. The temperature in the shaft is already 140 degrees. David's blood ran cold. He looked at the schematic glowing red on the screen. He remembered what he had tried to tell Victoria not 20 minutes ago. The automated logic was flawed. If the blast doors closed while the cables were burning, the heat and toxic smoke would bake whoever was in the elevator alive. "Bypass the blast doors," David ordered. "Open the vents!" "I can't," the tech cried. "The system locked us out. It requires a manual override from the sub-relay station on floor 54, right below her. But the elevators are dead, and the stairwells are sealed by the lockdown." Victoria Hastings was trapped in a glass oven, suspended hundreds of feet in the air, with no way out. The oxygen levels in her cab were dropping by the second. The smoke outside the glass was so thick she couldn't see the city skyline anymore. She stripped off her blazer, coughing violently as the temperature inside the cab spiked. She pounded on the reinforced glass with her fists, screaming for help. But there was no one to hear her. The ruthless billionaire was completely, utterly powerless. In the basement, the security guards and technicians stood frozen in horror. The fire department estimated it would take them 20 minutes to cut through the hardened steel blast doors from the outside. Victoria had maybe 8 minutes before she suffocated or burned. David stared at the screen. He was the only person in the building who knew about the old maintenance crawl space, a narrow, forgotten ventilation shaft that bypassed the sealed stairwells and led directly to the sub-relay station on floor 54. He had built it himself during a retrofit 3 years ago. He looked at the cardboard box holding his daughter's picture. He thought of the cold, dead eyes of the woman who had just thrown his child's life away without a second thought. If he walked out the door right now, no one could blame him. He wasn't an employee anymore. It wasn't his problem. The woman who had ruined him was about to pay the ultimate price for her own arrogance. But then, he thought of Chloe. He thought of what he wanted to teach his daughter about being a good person in a cruel world. David swore under his breath, dropped his box, and grabbed his heavy titanium wrench. "Get the paramedics ready at the floor. 54 service entrance," David barked to the stunned security team. "Where are you going?" the guard yelled. "You're fired. You can't go up there." "I'm the only one who can," David yelled back, sprinting toward the dark, narrow access panel at the back of the basement. And I'm not doing it for her. The access panel behind the basement lockers opened into a vertical nightmare. It was a utility shaft barely 3 feet wide, lined with a rusted iron ladder that stretched straight up into the lightless belly of the skyscraper. The air inside was stale, thick with decades of undisturbed dust and the growing, acrid scent of melting rubber. David clipped his flashlight to his shoulder strap, secured his heavy titanium wrench into his belt, and began to climb. 54 flights. It was a physical feat that would have broken a professional athlete under normal circumstances, let alone a sleep-deprived father running purely on adrenaline. By the 10th floor, his arms were burning, the lactic acid pooling in his shoulders. By the 20th floor, he was gasping for breath, the air in the shaft growing noticeably thinner and hotter as the fire raging above began to bake the building's core. "Don't stop," he told himself, picturing Chloe's pale face against the stark white hospital pillows. "If you stop, she dies. If she dies, you die." Keep moving. High above him, inside the glass cage of the executive drop, Victoria Hastings was experiencing something she had successfully avoided her entire life. Absolute, paralyzing terror. The temperature inside the cab had surpassed 110 degrees. The designer silk blouse that had commanded so much authority an hour ago was now soaked with sweat and clinging to her skin. The heavy smoke outside the glass was impenetrable, a swirling black storm that mocked her isolation. She slammed her bleeding fists against the reinforced glass. "Help me!" she screamed, her voice cracking, swallowing mouthfuls of the thinning, superheated air. "I am Victoria Hastings. Somebody help me!" Silence. Only the ominous metallic groaning of the elevator cables above her, stressed by the intense heat of the fire. She stumbled backward and collapsed onto the floor of the cab, coughing violently. Her lungs burned. Her vision began to blur at the edges, tunneling into darkness. She pulled her dead cell phone from her pocket. No signal. She looked at the multi-million-dollar merger contracts scattered across the floor, the documents she had signed right before ruining a man's life. For the first time in her 38 years, the true, horrifying weight of her existence crashed down upon her. Her billions of dollars, her offshore accounts, her luxury penthouses, her ruthless reputation. None of it could buy her a single breath of oxygen. None of it could open the doors. As the heat intensified and her consciousness began to slip, a single image flashed in her mind. The desperate, tear-filled eyes of David Gallagher, begging for his daughter's life. "I am going to die here," Victoria realized, a solitary tear cutting a track through the soot on her cheek. "And no one is going to weep for me." Down in the shaft, David hit the 40th floor. His hands were bloody, the skin torn by the jagged rust of the ladder rungs. The heat was now suffocating, pushing 130 degrees in the enclosed space. Every breath felt like swallowing hot ash. His muscles seized, his vision swimming with dark spots. "I can't," he thought, his boots slipping on a rung. He dangled by one arm over the black abyss below. "I'm too late. I have to go back." Then a violent shudder rocked the building. The sound of snapping steel echoed down the shaft. One of the primary elevator suspension cables had melted through. The sound snapped David out of his exhaustion. He hoisted himself up, screaming through the pain, and climbed with a renewed, frantic desperation. 45, 50, 52. When he finally reached the 54th floor access door, he was running on nothing but sheer willpower. He shoved his shoulder against the heavy steel hatch. It didn't budge. The power surge had engaged the magnetic security locks. David unholstered his titanium wrench. With a primal roar, he swung the heavy metal tool, smashing it into the electronic locking mechanism. Sparks showered over his face. He hit it again and again, until the casing shattered and the magnetic seal broke with a hiss. He practically fell out of the shaft and onto the floor of the mechanical relay room. Alarms were blaring. A deafening swan that vibrated in his teeth. The server racks in the room were flashing red, desperately trying to root power away from the fire blazing on the floors above. David scrambled to his feet and sprinted to the main override terminal. His bloody fingers flew across the keyboard. He bypassed the initial firewall, overriding the automated lockdown logic he knew intimately. But as he pulled up the system diagnostics to release the blast doors, a massive anomaly on the screen caught his eye. David froze. The fire wasn't an accident. The mainframe hadn't just malfunctioned. The command log clearly showed a deliberate, manual override initiated from the 62nd floor, the executive HR and accounting suites. Someone had intentionally overloaded the primary server bank to trigger a catastrophic fire, simultaneously deploying a data-wiping worm into the company's financial archives. David looked at the authorization code on the screen. R. Cunningham, Richard, the ambitious, perfectly groomed supervisor who had handed David his termination papers. Richard had embezzled millions from the Q3 profits, and knowing the external audit was happening tomorrow, he had triggered a localized disaster to destroy the evidence. The lockdown, the trapped CEO. It was all collateral damage in Richard's desperate cover-up. David didn't have time to process the sheer malice of it. He copied the command log to his encrypted technician's datapad, shoved it into his pocket, and slammed his hand onto the massive manual release lever for the shaft blast doors. A heavy hydraulic groan echoed through the floorboards as the steel blast doors sealing off the 55th floor finally retracted. David grabbed a red emergency fire axe from the wall, strapped a heavy oxygen respirator mask over his face, and charged toward the stairwell. He kicked the door open and sprinted up the single flight of stairs to floor 55. The elevator lobby was a war zone. Thick, blinding smoke choked the corridor. The heat was unbearable. David crawled on his hands and knees beneath the smoke layer, dragging the axe until he reached the glass doors of the elevator shaft. Through the thick, soot-stained glass, he saw the executive drop. It was hanging precariously, tilting at a terrifying angle. Only 2 of the 4 suspension cables remained intact, and the fire from above was licking at the metal roof of the cab. Inside, Victoria Hastings was lying motionless on the floor. "Victoria!" David screamed, his voice muffled by his respirator. The outer shaft doors were wedged shut, warped by the intense heat. David swung the fire axe, embedding the blade into the seam between the doors. He threw his entire body weight against the handle, using it as a lever. His muscles screamed in protest, tearing under the strain. With a deafening screech of grinding metal, the doors parted just enough. David squeezed through the gap, stepping onto the top of the glass cab. The metal was scalding hot, burning through the soles of his boots. He swung the axe down into the emergency escape hatch on the roof of the elevator, shattering the reinforced locking pin. He dropped down into the blistering heat of the cab. Victoria was barely breathing, her lips tinged blue from oxygen deprivation. David quickly unstrapped his respirator mask and pressed it firmly over her nose and mouth. He purged the valve, forcing pure, cool oxygen into her starved lungs. Victoria's eyes fluttered open. She gasped, choking as the oxygen hit her system. Her vision cleared, and she looked up at the man leaning over her. His face was covered in grease, soot, and blood. It was the single father she had fired less than an hour ago. "Mr. Gallagher," she whispered, her voice incredibly weak, her mind unable to comprehend what was happening. "Why?" "Save your breath, Miss Hastings," David grunted, wrapping his thick arms around her waist. "We have to go. Now." Above them, a horrific snapping sound echoed through the shaft. The third cable gave way. The elevator lurched violently, dropping 3 feet before the final cable caught it. The glass walls cracked. "Hold on to me," David yelled. He hoisted Victoria onto his shoulder, ignoring the burning agony in his back. He climbed up through the shattered hatch, dragging her dead weight out of the cab and onto the roof. The final cable began to unravel, the steel threads pinging like bullets. David threw Victoria through the pried-open shaft doors onto the carpeted floor of the 55th floor lobby, diving through the gap right behind her. A split second later, the final cable snapped. The executive drop plummeted into the abyss, disappearing into the smoke before violently smashing into the basement buffers 50 floors below with a concussive boom that shook the entire skyscraper. David collapsed next to Victoria, both of them lying on the floor, gasping for the relatively cleaner air of the lobby. Minutes later, heavily armored firefighters breached the stairwell, finding the two of them side by side. As the paramedics loaded Victoria onto a stretcher, she weakly reached out, grabbing David's soot-stained hand. She didn't say a word, but the icy, ruthless glare that had defined her existence was completely gone. In its place was a profound, shattered gratitude. Before they took her away, David reached into his pocket. He pulled out the encrypted datapad and handed it to the police captain coordinating the evacuation. "Check the security logs," David coughed, pointing to the screen. "Richard Cunningham caused the fire. He wiped the financial servers. He's trying to run." Down in the lobby, Richard Cunningham was furiously typing on his phone, attempting to transfer his offshore funds, pretending to look terrified for his CEO. He didn't even see the 3 police officers approach him until the cold steel of handcuffs snapped around his wrists. 1 week later, the private room at the Chicago Children's Medical Center was filled with sunlight. Chloe sat up in her bed, a bright pink nasal cannula helping her breathe, laughing as she colored in a large picture book. David sat beside her, looking infinitely older, but completely at peace. The door to the hospital room opened quietly. Victoria Hastings walked in. She wasn't wearing her usual power suit. She wore a simple, elegant beige sweater and slacks. She still looked pale, and a bandage peeked out from beneath her collar, a lingering reminder of the burns she had sustained. She carried a massive, ridiculously oversized stuffed elephant. Chloe's eyes went wide. "Whoa! Hi, Chloe," Victoria said softly, offering a tentative smile. "I'm Victoria. I work with your dad." David stood up, stunned. "Ms. Hastings, you shouldn't be out of bed. The news said you were recovering in private." Victoria set the elephant down at the foot of Chloe's bed. She turned to David, the silence stretching between them. She looked at the monitors, keeping the little girl alive. And then she looked at the man who had walked through hell to save the life of the woman who had condemned him. "I owe you my life, David," Victoria said, her voice thick with an emotion she had never allowed herself to feel before. "But more than that, I owe you an apology. I was a machine. I looked at spreadsheets instead of souls. Sitting in that elevator, waiting to die, I realized that if I burned, I would leave nothing good behind in this world. Only cold bank accounts and terrified employees." David didn't know what to say. He simply nodded. Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. She handed it to David. "I fired Richard," she said, a hint of her old steel returning for just a moment. "He's facing 20 years in federal prison. The The board is reeling, but I am still the majority shareholder. Inside that envelope is a contract. I am appointing you the new Vice President of Global Infrastructure for Vanguard Innovations. You will report directly to me." David stared at the envelope, his hands trembling. "Ms. Hastings, I don't have an engineering degree. I'm a technician. You're the smartest man in my building and the bravest man I've ever met," Victoria countered firmly. "But there is a condition." David swallowed hard. "What is it?" Victoria looked down at Chloe, her eyes softening completely. "Vanguard's experimental immunology division is the best in the world. As of this morning, Chloe is fully enrolled in our premier treatment program. Every hospital bill, every specialist, every medication is covered by the company. Forever." She looked back at David, tears pooling in her icy blue eyes. "The condition is that you never let your job interfere with being a father again. If Chloe needs you, you drop everything. Am I understood?" David Gallagher broke down. The weight of the last 9 months, the grief, the terror, the exhaustion, it all shattered. He wept, covering his face with his hands. Victoria stepped forward and did something she hadn't done in 2 decades. She wrapped her arms around him and hugged him tight. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder. "Thank you for reminding me how to be human. Sometimes the universe strips away our power just to show us what truly matters. True wealth isn't measured by the money in your bank account, but by the compassion in your heart and the people who stand by you in the fire. If this story moved you, please hit the like button. Share this incredible, real-life journey of redemption with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories that prove humanity always wins in the end.